Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance. Join our hosts as they discuss a wide range of topics and speak with leading cybersecurity, technology, and compliance experts. Now is the time for Secure Talk.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk, brought to you by Adequest, your cybersecurity and compliance partner. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I and Hira Machado, the CEO of Adequest, are your host for today's episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking about GDPR, that is the General Data and Protection Regulations that have come out of the EU. These are very, very important, primarily because if you're caught out of compliance, you can be fined up to 4% of your global revenues or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. But today we're going to take some time and we're going to talk about what is GDPR, what some of the things, some key definitions that you should be aware of, and then we're going to talk about some ideas or suggestions in terms of helping you prepare for GDPR. Hiram, how are you today?
Hello, Mark. I'm doing very well. What about you?
Very good. I'm in Boston today.
Fantastic.
We survived the snowstorm and having a lot of fun out here.
Sounds good.
Yeah. If you don't mind, maybe you can start off and can you give us a little bit of background about, what is GDPR, where did it come from, and where is it at? When does it become enforceable?
Absolutely. Well, GDPR is an European regulation. It was officialized about 2 years ago in 2016. And was given to every organization a 2 years period to adjust their processes and procedures and technology to compliance with GDPR. And GDPR will take effect as a law, as a regulation, starting May 25th, 2018. So we are just a couple of months away from that becoming a law and enforceable by the European authorities. It's important to notice, though, that even though it's an European regulation, it has a global reach. It's all about data privacy and data protection for European citizens. So any organization around the globe handling European citizens' private data are bound to comply with GDPR regulation. And as you said, the fines can be rather large. So many organizations around the globe are watching very closely and working on, or at least starting to work on, updating their processes, procedures, and technology to comply with GDPR.
Now, these regulations, did they just appear out of the blue, or are these regulations a derivative of past requirements in legislation?
Well, European Union have, or the Europeans have had a since 1995, they have had this kind of directive, which is more like a guideline, for the different European states to go ahead and put their own laws in place. So as a directive, that's not enforceable by law. So with the advancement, and that's a 1995 directive. So as you might imagine, technology wasn't as advanced, much less cloud computing wasn't as popular, or even the internet at that time. So with the advance of technology, it was found that directive needed to be updated, and moreover, not only be updated, really made into a more global law, or as a regulation, it applies to every European country, and it applies to every organization handling European citizens or residents, rather, data.
So what are some of the key regulations that we should be aware of? We'll dive into what type of data is affected next. But right now, what are some of the key things that companies should be aware of in terms of their responsibilities, in terms of how they manage data that relates to EU residents?
Absolutely. There are many nuances of the GDPR that most organizations will have to pay attention to and potentially revisit their processes, procedures, and technologies. So number one is the right to be forgotten, right? So as a European resident, they are now giving the right to be forgotten to any organization. So if you are interacting with them and you have private data, and you host private data from them, and you receive a call from them saying, I want you to erase all of my data, you have to have the mechanism in place, procedure and technology in place to delete all of the data as per request. So that's an obligation of the organization hosting the data.
So, for example, if I buy something from a online retailer and I'm a European resident, if I'm a European resident and I buy something from a European, or excuse me, any retailer online, they collect my data. And then one day I call them or send them an email and say, you know what, I want you to delete my information from your system. They have to do that, right?
Absolutely. Every organization will be obligated to do it. There are rare exceptions. There are rare exceptions in which that can be. And that's when, for example, maybe a malicious person who have done something wrong and says, I want you to delete all of my data. Legally, you might be bound to hold on to that data if there is a greater legal argument. But you have to prove that greater legal argument later on if needed. But there are some nuances of exceptions, if you will.
Okay, so the right to be forgotten, I think there's also the right of rectification. So sometimes, organizations have your information, have your data, but they might not have correct versions of it. And you can also request that they update, and they have to comply with that, correct?
Not only that, they have to comply with that, as well as you have to have the ability to report on the data. So they have the right to know what data you have and for what purpose you host that data. So that you need to be very sensitive to that, and again have the technology in place that will allow you to properly report on all of. As you know, Mark, many organizations, and that's not, we've talked to so many of them, and it's not uncommon when you ask the question, where is the data throughout the organization between all of the database, different applications, structured and unstructured data. When you look throughout, it's not uncommon that organizations lose the perspective of where the data might actually reside, right? So moving forward, we cannot lose that perspective anymore, right? We have to have our ducks in a row. We need to know where the data is so we can both, one, report to them when needed and when requested, as well as make sure that we properly address any request such as the right to be forgotten.
Excellent. And a lot of people might be asking, well, what types of data would fall under GDPR? And, obviously anything that's any kind of, your databases, any kind of Excel documents, any kind of your client databases, but it also can be things like, customer feedback forms, it could be emails, it can even be images or CCTV scans. If that scan or that video or that image or that email contains data or relates to an EU resident, I should say, then it would fall under GDPR. Is that correct?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And most organizations are not entirely set up for handling the classification and understanding of all of that data and where it is. And so there is definitely work to be done for most organizations. And by the way, that is true from very small business all the way to large, from what we have seen.
Well, we're going to talk about maybe some ideas in terms of how to prepare for GDPR in a second. But before that, maybe we can talk about some definitions, because people say, well, we have data, but we're just handling that on behalf of our client. Or maybe I have data, but I'm outsourcing some of the manipulation or processing of that data. So a couple of the key definitions under GDPR relate to the idea of a controller and a processor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're right. And that's a very important definition for every organization to understand. In fact, many of our clients claim not to have any themselves clients in Europe, but sometimes they are handling on behalf of their own customers sensitive data about European residents, and they are asked for their clients whether they are compliant or not with GDPR. In fact, another point is it's important for every organization. There are also requests to check with their suppliers whether the suppliers that are handling sensitive data on their behalf, whether they are compliant with GDPR. So talking about it, as you mentioned, there is the controller and the processor. The controller is the organization that is responsible for collecting the data, right? So in a typical organization, as an example, an organization will collect data about employees, right? And if they have employees that are European residents, EU residents, they will collect data about those employees. And in doing so, they are the controller, right? They have their perhaps bank account information, they have their social security number or the equivalent in each one of the European countries, and their addresses and so on. Now, most organizations will pass on some of those sensitive information to perhaps a payroll company, a company that will handle all of the payroll for that organization. That payroll company is the processor of the data, and both are equally liable to compliance with GDPR.
Wow. So, like you said, if a company says, well, hey, we don't have a business in Europe, but if you have data that's, customers in Europe, you still fall under GDPR. And maybe you don't have either. Maybe you don't have any offices in Europe. Maybe you don't have any customers in Europe. Maybe you don't have any employees in Europe. But if you are processing data on behalf of an organization and that data relates to EU residents, you would fall under GDPR as a processor. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And we also have these questions that many organizations are asking. Well, I don't have any entity or presence in Europe. How will the European Union find me, right? Well, there are many ways, and there are recourse that they can use. They can invoke international laws and that way come after applying their laws against you. Generally speaking, if we are talking about the United States, we really don't know what's going to be like. Nobody can answer that question for sure because there has never been a case yet, since it's not a law. But expectations, however, from when we talk to experts, is that there is very much strong interest between Europe and the United States in terms of commerce and trade and relationship, that it's likely that a law in the United States a court in the United States will look for some level of collaboration with them, because that is what they expect in return when they want to apply their own laws and overseas, right? Particularly in Europe. So number one, there is that expectation. Second, they can ban your organization from being able to do business in Europe. That would be probably the least invasive way of applying the regulation on you. But there are also ways for them to do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of companies in the U.S. Or in other places are working towards compliance for GDPR, not just because of GDPR, but because they realize that this is a global trend towards data protection and privacy and individual rights in terms of protecting their data. And so they realize, well, it's GDPR today. There's going to be something in America tomorrow. There's going to be something in their country later. In fact, China just came out with their own version of GDPR, which apparently is supposed to be even stricter than GDPR. So working towards compliance toward GDPR probably will help you with, some protection in terms of falling out of compliance, but will also help you in some of the other areas that you may be doing business. Speaking of which, if we talk about preparation for GDPR, Um, you know, do you have any thoughts in terms of how an organization, where do they start? Because it's a lot of companies out there, like they're like, oh my God, it's May 25th. What do we do? How do we get started?
Yeah, there is this whole thing about, what's going to happen on May 5th, right? And the expectation right now is, you know, uh, they cannot look into every single organization around the globe on May 25th. So the expectation is that's when the regulation goes into being enforceable, and the regulators will start looking for companies that are out of compliance, and that will happen gradually as they work through their jobs, and they find irregularities around the globe. That's number one. So really what we tell all of our clients today is just get with it, right? If you are ever encounter regulation coming after you, the worst thing that can happen is I had an incident, I had a data breach, and I was doing nothing about GDPR. That's the worst thing that can happen. As long as you have started on something and you know where you are in the process, that's already one step ahead. And that's where most organizations are today anyway. There are very few companies that I would say that I would call 100% compliant with GDPR, or they're even, I would expect to be 100% compliant with GDPR by May 25th. But hey, you have to start somewhere, and it's time to start.
Well, in fact, you bring up a good point because a lot of experts in the field have said that it's really tough to be 100% compliant. In fact, we don't even really know what that is. The important thing is you're working towards compliance, and they expect that the regulators will have a friendlier posture towards you. They expect, and again, we're not predicting this. We don't give legal advice, but the consensus that we've kind of been hearing is that if you're working on a plan towards compliance and you can document that and demonstrate that the regulators would take a more friendly posture towards you in the case of any type of breaches or complaints. Now, Hiram, if you don't mind, maybe I can suggest a couple ideas in terms of how companies could move towards compliance. So
yeah, that's, I think it's important to tell them what steps might be.
Sure. So one thing that I think every organization should think of is take a picture or a snapshot, get an idea of where you currently at in terms of your people, processes, and technology in the context of GDPR compliance. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to take a type of assessment. Now, we AdeQuest provides something that an assessment that was developed by Microsoft. By the way, Microsoft is 100% committed towards GDPR compliance by May 25th of this year. So, I mean, they are all in on this. They developed a 160 question assessment that looks at all your people, processes, and technologies in the context of GDPR compliance. If you go through that assessment, and it's a bit of work, but it should be, if you go through that assessment, you will have a very clear picture of where you're at right now in terms of compliance with GDPR. In fact, the assessment will deliver recommendations and identify any gaps, and all recommendations are mapped to specific GDPR regulations. So the assessment, it will give you instantly a snapshot and identify any major gaps. Just doing the assessment helps you because it shows that, hey, you know what, you recognize that GDPR is important, and you trying to figure out where you're at. Once you've done the assessment, you can put together a plan that will bridge any of those gaps. Another thing you can do is identify what data is it that you have, and where's it at, and does it fall under GDPR? So we have a program called the Data Discovery Toolkit or Data Discovery Program, and we work with organizations We help them map out the data that they think they have, and then we run a scan of their IT infrastructure, whether that's on-prem, in the cloud, or a hybrid environment. We have a variety of tools that we can use to scan the system and then identify the data. But we can actually even at the same time go beyond that, and we can label that data and then attach policies to those labels so that, for example, if there's PII that's identified, that a certain policy is enforced. And maybe Hiram, can you give an example of how this would work, for example, with maybe with a credit card information or something like that? How would that work? After the data has been identified and labeled, how do the policies actually affect the real world handling of that data?
Yeah, absolutely. With the right systems in place, right, we can use something called DLP, data loss prevention, right? And with DLP, you can, for example, automate the process of identifying keywords or key elements in any document that's being created within your organization, such as credit card number, right? So we know the pattern of credit card number. We can, once the system identify, even if you are open up Word and you type in a credit number, the system can, if you choose to do so, automatically classify that Word document as confidential, for example, right? And if so, once you apply the classification to the document, now it's up to that organization to set up the policies and rules that will govern that classification. So what it means to any organization in this example, it could mean that that document cannot be shared outside of the organization, for example, right? And and now you have your systems working for you to make sure that you're only doing the right things with the data that you are handling.
Excellent. So again, just to recap, one thing you can do is you can do a detailed assessment to give you a snapshot of where your organization's at in terms of people, process, and technology. You can do a data discovery process or scan, and then at the same time that you're doing that, you can even actually label that data and then enforce policies. So instantly that helps you protect that data. It also will help you with reporting, because if there's a breach, you would know who you would have to notify. Because in the case, I should back up, under GDPR, if there's a breach, one, you'll have to notify the regulators, but two, you may have to notify every individual whose data may have been every individual who's an EU resident whose data may have been compromised. So, that's something that if you don't have labels on that data, if you don't have a process for doing that, good luck. It's going to be tough. The last thing that I want to talk about, and then we can just kind of, kick this back and forth, open conversation, is that another thing that most enterprises that we work with are dealing or use Microsoft Office 365 or Exchange or Exchange, and if you think about GDPR, a lot of it's about data protection, and it's also about IT security. The amazing thing is there's a huge amount of IT security, a large number of features that are already baked in or built into, for example, Office 365. And it may be built into whatever platform you're using. Unfortunately, I'm just going to use Office 365 as an example here. Most organizations aren't aware of all the tools that they're already built into Office 365 and that they're paying for. And it's kind of crazy because, we hear something like, only 15 to 20% of the organizations that have purchased Office 365 are using the security features that are built in there. Not because they don't want to use them, it's just they're not aware of them, okay? So there's a couple different tools and programs that you can use that will instantly let you know what's your IT security posture currently, or where how your settings are set, and map out any gaps and make recommendations. Hiram, can you talk a little bit about the Secure Score?
Yes, there's a couple of things that we can talk about in this regard. One is the security score. So one thing that everybody should understand is there is some misunderstanding perhaps, right? That some people may believe that, oh, I'm going to go to the cloud, I'm going to my data on the cloud, and I'm automatically protected, and I expect my cloud provider to be GDPR compliant, therefore I'm compliant. That's not the case, right? And while it is true, though, that there is a layer of compliance that once you go to the cloud, that you transfer the responsibility to your cloud provider, right? There is another layer of security controls that it's your responsibility as the controller of the data and the owner of the data to set up and put in place, even if you are on the cloud. So for that reason, right, if you're using Microsoft 365, there is something called Secure Score. That if you log in as an administrator to securescore.com, securescore.office.com, you can see where you stand. And basically, it will tell you that you may be, you may have 30 points out of 400 points or so, right? Which is, by the way, the reality of most organizations that have their Office 365 instance set up. And that is because they haven't put the time and effort to understand all of the security controls already available for them that they can enable, such as DLP, multi-factor authentications, and many other things that you can do to protect your systems, and therefore be more even closer to compliance with GDPR or any other regulation that you may have to be compliant with. So that's number one thing. The secure score, you need to look at it. You need to know where you are and understand what needs to be done. A lot of the customers that we are helping today, that's one big thing that we are doing for them, is to understand their requirements and bring that score to a higher level, closer to that match their requirement. Not everybody needs to be 400 out of 400, but you need to understand what kind of data you're dealing with and what's your security requirements, so you can bring it to the right level. The other one that I think it's becoming a little bit popular, and we have been using ever since private preview, and now it's public preview, is Compliance Manager. So basically, Microsoft released, along with Office 365, the Compliance Manager. It's a list of all of the security controls that are already enabled on the cloud, and it shows compliance with not only GDPR, but GDPR, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and but also it shows all of the controls that GDPR requires that is your responsibility, right? And now we can work through those requirements and make sure that you are up to date. The compliance manager is great because, number one, you don't have to pay for it. Number two, it helps you organize yourselves and understand what you need to be compliant with. And it helps you to report to the authorities when needed that you are compliant and show how so. So I encourage everybody to think about those two things. If compliance in general is something that is important for you and your organization.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent suggestion and overview of Secure Score and Compliance Manager. We're getting towards the end of this program here. I would like to also encourage anybody who's listening and concerned about GDPR to consult with a privacy or any attorney, a privacy attorney or any other attorney that specializes in GDPR or data protection issues. You may also want to talk to your business insurance provider because oftentimes you'll have insurance that will be there in place in case there's you have some type of data breach, and you may find that your policy protects you with GDPR or for GDPR, and you may find that it doesn't. So you should be aware of that. But you should also get their different perspectives and opinions in terms of how you could prepare for GDPR. If you go ahead.
And by the way, Mark, I want to tell everybody we are well connected in the industry. Anybody listening to this podcast, if you need, if you'd like a reference to a private lawyer or insurance company, let us know. Just reach out.
Absolutely. And if you'd like more information about GDPR in terms of IT security, data protection, or anything, why don't you just come to our website, contact us, and we'd be very, very happy to speak with you. I think that's about it for today. I mean, we could spend hours and hours on this subject, but
I could go on forever.
Yeah, exactly. But we don't, we try to limit this to about 30 minutes or so. I think we've done that. Hiram, thank you so much for your time and information.
Thank you, Mark. Great exchange. Loved it.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to Secure Talk. Remember, Secure Talk is brought to you by AdeQuest, your cybersecurity and compliance partner. Take care, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Hello. Welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance. Join our hosts as they discuss a wide range of topics and speak with leading cybersecurity, technology, and compliance experts. Now is the time for Secure Talk.